Welcome to this rapid revision video, which consists of my predictions for the Pearson Edexcel GCSE History Paper 3 for 2025. The topics I'll be focusing on in this video are Germany 1918 to 1939, USA conflict at home and abroad 1954 to 1975, and Russia and the Soviet Union 1917 to 1941. I'm afraid if you're doing one of the other topics, I simply don't have enough information and experience on those papers to help out, so I'm just not going to make predictions on those. Really sorry about that, but hopefully some of my other videos have helped you instead. Okay, let's get into the changes to paper 3. In common with paper 1 and paper 2, there have been some minor changes to paper 3 as well. Here's how the exam looked last year and in all years before that. The change is to question 2. This is the 12-mark explain question. Here's how it looks now. Question 2 has become question 2A and question 2B, but you won't need to answer both of them. Instead, you'll need to choose one of those questions to answer, and obviously you're going to choose the question that you're most familiar with. Both questions will be worth 12 marks, be focused on causation or why things happened, and have 2 stimulus points of knowledge to get you started. Before we get into the predictions, a quick plug for me. Have I helped you? If yes, then please help me help others. As many of you are aware, I'm a full-time history teacher and a head of department at a secondary school, and originally these videos were just my way of helping my students, and in fact they were how I delivered my lessons in lockdown during COVID. But now I know that they help many thousands of others too, which is brilliant. But of course my priority has always got to be my actual students who are in my actual classes. That's what I'm paid to do. Nevertheless, this year I've added crime and punishment and Cold War rapid revision playlists on top of my day job, which totals up to hundreds of hours of work. So if I have helped you and you want to thank me, then please subscribe. And crucially, stay subscribed after the exams finish. Obviously, YouTube doesn't understand if I lose a load of subscribers just because the exams are finished. So one really little way you can thank me is by subscribing and staying subscribed. I'm not going to go down the route of having paid for services or Patreon or anything like that. So this is one little thing that you can do for me if you want to say thank you. All right, that out the way, let's consider these predictions. As ever, these predictions need to be treated with a certain amount of wise caution. These predictions are actually more of a demonstration of what topics have appeared only infrequently since 2018. The exam boards often use the same topics repeatedly, as we shall see. The only way of really being sure is to try and know everything, and I know that's not what you want to hear. However, these can still be useful. Don't just focus your revision on the predictions. That's a really good way of becoming unstuck, and you'll only try and blame me. Instead, if a prediction happens to be in an area that you know that you are weak on, use that to guide your revision and help you prioritise what you need to know. All right, that quick disclaimer out the way, let's get into our first topic, Germany 1918 to 1939. This is how last year's exam looked. Give 2 things you can infer from source A about how Hitler increased support for the Nazi Party in the 1920s. The source, if I remember rightly, was a painting of Hitler speaking to an early party group. And then explain why the situation in Germany was unstable in the years 1918 to 1923. The stimulus points were the Spartacist revolt and the hyperinflation. Do bear in mind that this time you'll get a choice of between 2 different 12-mark answers. You only need to answer one. The next part of the paper looked like this. Question 3A. How useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into Nazi methods of controlling the German people in the years 1933 to 39? There was quite a focus on things like propaganda and the law courts with this one. And then the interpretations that went with that looked like this. So ultimately, the focus of the inquiry was Nazi methods of controlling the German people in the years 1933 to 39. And the question 3A, B, C and D are all related. There are 2 sources to use and 2 related interpretations. Bearing that in mind, what sort of topics have been repeatedly included? Well, not that many, but challenges to the Weimar Republic, which admittedly is a really broad topic, has come up time and again. The unpopularity of the Weimar Republic came up in 2021, the Treaty of Versailles also came up in 2021, and the instability of the Weimar Republic came up this year. So maybe they're going to focus on a different aspect of Weimar this year, if it appears at all. Also, the Nazi Party in the 1920s seems to have come up quite a bit as well. This was in the sample paper, 2021 and 2023. So that's come up fairly recently too. Are they going to try and diversify a little bit this year? Those are the only things in this particular course that have come up repeatedly. Now let's consider the topics for question 3. So question 3A is worth 8 marks, B and C are both worth 4 marks, and D is worth 20 marks in total, including the spelling, punctuation and grammar. So there's a lot of marks attached to this one area. This can make this paper quite frustrating because actually the breadth of topics that you're being asked on is really quite narrow. So how can we try and predict what's going to come up this year? Well, let's consider what's come up before. The sample paper that was given to teachers before the GCSE was sat was on a Nazi Germany topic. It was on the Hitler Youth. In 2018, the public examination was the Weimar Republic and the challenges between 1919 and 1923. And then it went back to Nazi Germany and it focused on women. The 2020 paper, which admittedly not many people sat, was also on Nazi Germany, looking at the extent of support from 1933 to 39. Then it went back to the Weimar Republic, support for the Nazis in that early period. And then 2022, it was the Weimar Republic again. Hitler becomes Chancellor. Then in 2023, it was the Weimar Republic for a third time. So there were Weimar cultural changes. I predicted last year that Nazi Germany would come up in 2024, and it did. Control and propaganda being the topic. So this presents us with a problem. Is it going to flip back to the Weimar Republic again, or is it going to flip back to Nazi Germany? Now, I don't think we can really read too much into the patterns here. If we do, then it suggests that there's going to be another Nazi Germany topic, but I really don't think we can be sure of that this year, so I wouldn't put any money on that whatsoever. But it would seem to fit the pattern. Maybe the exam board will agree with that, because the Weimar Republic has appeared slightly more often than Nazi Germany, particularly when you consider that very few people did the 2020 paper. So this is not really much of a prediction. I really don't think it's a safe one, but perhaps we are due another Nazi Germany topic. I suppose only time will tell. This section should get shorter every year, almost by definition. These are the topics that have never appeared. Again, the narrow nature of this paper means that there are always going to be a few of these until we're many years down the line. But for the Weimar Germany part of the paper, women in Weimar Germany has never appeared. So looking at changes for women in the golden 20s, for example, that's never appeared. And that's a really nice topic. You would have thought there would have been something, maybe a 12 marker for that one there. Workers and standard of living in Weimar Germany has also not come up. That's probably a bigger part of the course when it comes to life in Nazi Germany, so maybe that explains it. But again, it's on the specification and it's not appeared. Hitler's early career. Well, what we mean by that is his time before the Nazi Party. Generally, you only really learn this for context. I don't think that's a good prediction, so I would focus on the other ones. And the Munich Putsch, that's not come up either. Now, that's a really famous event. It's something that could form part of a 16 marker. You could get a source on it. You could get an explanation question on it looking at causation. So I'm actually really quite surprised that the Beer Hall Putsch or Munich Putsch hasn't appeared before. And also, unemployment in Weimar Germany hasn't come up as a discrete question. It will have been relevant to questions looking at the rise of the Nazis and Hitler gaining power, but it's not had its own discrete question yet. So that's quite a lot. On to the next part then. These are all the things that haven't yet appeared for Nazi Germany. Surprisingly, the Enabling Act itself of 1933 has not come up, though it would have been relevant to other questions looking at Hitler gaining power, as would have been the Night of the Long Knives. Workers and the standard of living in Nazi Germany hasn't appeared though. Strength through joy might be one of the ways of looking at this, so perhaps you could have an interpretations question on this, one looking at how the Nazis tried to improve lives for workers and whether or not they really did. I can imagine that being the focus for interpretations. So you might have some interpretations saying that actually life for workers got better, and others saying no, it was all a con, it was all a scam, life didn't really get better for them, it was pure propaganda. Another thing that's not come up, despite it being quite an important part of the course, even if it's not a particularly enjoyable one, is the Nazi racial beliefs part of that. Okay, I'm not going to expand on that one too much, but you can imagine that's a big part of the course. If you're unfamiliar with any of these things, might well be worth revising them. What about the things that have only rarely appeared? Well, for Weimar Germany, that would include the Golden 20s, that period of recovery. That came up in the 2020 exam, but like I say, that's not really been covered much since, and not many people sat that paper. The same can be said for Gustav Stresemann. He only appeared in the 2020 paper as well. Now, this would be an ideal topic for the interpretations question, looking at whether Gustav Stresemann really did improve things in Germany or whether he was just disguising much bigger underlying flaws. The historical debate there would make it really suitable for one of those interpretations and source-based questions. Although, admittedly, perhaps we are due a Nazi Germany topic this year. But that would be a good one to look at. If you don't want to mourn about in terms of Stresemann's work, go away and revise it. What about Nazi Germany? Well, culture in Nazi Germany, looking at the policy surrounding things like art and music and the way that certain types of art and music were suppressed and other things were emphasised, that's not really come up. There was a question in the 2018 paper that was related to the Olympics though. Women and families in Nazi Germany is a really big topic. There has been a brief question on youth, but there's not really been one on women and families in Germany since 2019. Looking specifically here at the Nazi era, by the way. And also youth, that's not come up since 2019 either. Those two things, of course, are related, so again, it might be a good focus for your revision. And then the persecution of minorities. Like the racial policies one that we discussed before, this hasn't really come up and it is a pretty unpleasant one. But remember, you could still be assessed on it. This has come up in 2021, which looked at Kristallnacht, but looking at the more broad persecution of minorities in Nazi Germany, that's not really appeared since. So, could be a good one to look at. All right, that's the end of my so-called predictions for Germany 1918 to 1939. Well, the best of luck. Let's move on to civil rights and Vietnam. The USA conflict at home and abroad exam looked like this last year. Give 2 things you can infer from source A about the treatment of black Americans in the 1950s. That was a pretty generous question. Most people did all right with that one there. Now, the explain question was explain why the USA were not able to win the war against the Viet Cong in the years 1964 to 1975. I didn't much like the wording of the question there. It was a little bit wordy and a little bit confusing, but actually otherwise it's a pretty decent question. Do remember though that the 12-mark question this year is going to be split. So you'll have a choice of 2 different 12-mark questions that you can do, and you only have to answer one of them. So that's probably a positive change. What about the sources and interpretations questions? Well, the overarching inquiry for this was the achievements of Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement. This was a pretty generous and broad topic. You could take in everything from the Montgomery Improvement Association and the Montgomery bus boycott, going right the way through to 1963 and the March on Washington, and all the way through to his less successful campaigns in the North and against poverty. One of the sources was a photograph of the March on Washington, suggested that he achieved a lot, and the other one was about the lack of progress in living conditions, suggesting that Martin Luther King maybe didn't achieve as much as people think. And of course the interpretations followed a similar suit. There are only a very few repeated inclusions for this topic, which is to be expected given how narrow this exam tends to be. The only thing that's appeared repeatedly really is opposition to the Vietnam War, particularly looking at the media, which was focus of the sample paper with an inferences question, the 2021 inferences question, and in 2022 it was part of the explanation question for 12 marks. What hasn't appeared though is support for the Vietnam War, so maybe it's the turn of something else. The narrowness of this part of the paper can be explained by question 3, A, B, C and D, which are all related to the same inquiry. So which ones have come before? The sample paper that was given to us teachers was on civil rights, and that was on Brown versus Topeka. Then in 2018 it was a Vietnam topic looking at the Tet Offensive. Then in 2019 it was on civil rights, the Freedom Summer and JFK. Then in 2020, an exam that very few people remember, it was on Vietnam, reasons for US failure. So it goes civil rights, Vietnam, civil rights, Vietnam. This is where it starts to change. In 2021, it was on civil rights, life in the 1950s. Then it was on civil rights again, looking at the Black Panthers. Then it was on civil rights again, the Freedom Summer and Mississippi murders. So last year, I predicted that it would be on Vietnam. After all, it would be incredible for them to do 4 years of civil rights in a row. And of course, that's what they did, looking at the achievements of Martin Luther King. So it just shows you really can't guarantee it, can you? But this year I'm going to make another bet that it's going to be a Vietnam focus for question 3. Of course, the exam board could completely go against that and they might well choose a civil rights topic. If they do though, I will say this much. In my humble opinion, that seems very unfair. There's been a massive imbalance between the amount that civil rights has been assessed in this paper compared to Vietnam. And given that they've basically both got equal weighting in the amount of teaching and the amount of learning that you need to do on it, that does seem a little bit of a raw deal. So my bet this year is going to be a Vietnam focus for question 3. This is where they prove me wrong, isn't it? Anyway, let's move on to what topics have and haven't appeared. So the following topics have all never appeared as far as I can tell from my records, starting with civil rights. Firstly, the murder of Emmett Till and its impact. There have been questions about treatment of black people in the 1950s where this would have been relevant, but it has not had its own question, possibly because it is a bit narrow. The early 1960s protests, including the Greensboro sit-ins in 1960, Freedom Riders in 1961, and James Meredith and Ole Miss in 1962, are a bit more surprising. They're really important, they're really famous, and it's really amazing that they've not come up with their own question before. If you're unfamiliar with any of these particular campaigns and their importance and what they achieved, have a look at it now. Go and watch the videos. Then another really surprising omission is Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. This is often included as something of a comparison to the more famous work of Martin Luther King, so if you're unfamiliar with it, it could well be worth revising it. And also Black Power. Yes, there has been an inquiry on the Black Panthers, which is related, but looking at the Black Power movement and its growth through things like SNCC, when it became the Student National Coordinating Committee instead of a Student Non-Violent Coordinating Committee, for example, that's not come up, and nor has CAUSE move away from its original inclusion of lots of white protesters to being a much more black-led movement. That's something that's not really been covered as well. Another really important aspect was the riots and the Kerner report, as a demonstration of the fact that although there had been legal gains in the early and mid-60s, it hadn't really had a knock-on impact on people's living conditions, particularly in the north, where most of the civil rights campaigns, of course, were in the deep south. So if you're unfamiliar with the issues of poverty in the north and the cause of these riots and their effects in the Kerner report, go and have a look at that now. Right, so those are all the things that have never appeared for civil rights. Let's move on to Vietnam. In terms of the Vietnam War topics, there are fewer of these. One of the really surprising ones, though, is support for the Vietnam War. It's worth remembering, of course, that there was always more support for the war than there was opposition to it, but it's opposition that tends to be more memorable. Maybe that explains why it's been a repeated inclusion in this exam. So if you're unfamiliar with things like the silent majority, the hard hats, fear of communism, and the reasons why people supported the war, that could be something to go and look at. Another really big topic is the peace negotiations and the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. Now this has appeared in the GCSE paper before, which very few people comparatively sit, but it's not been a part of the main paper. So again, this is one of those chewy areas of the course that's easy to forget. It's not that memorable. So if you need to, go back and look at it now because it's never appeared before. What about the topics that have only rarely appeared? Well, for civil rights, these include Brown versus Topeka. So the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case is a really important founding moment in the civil rights movement, but it's only ever appeared directly in the sample paper that was given out to teachers in 2016. So it's been a good while since this has turned up directly. Related to that is the Little Rock Nine, which only appeared in the 2019 paper. Now, if you look at those two things together, desegregation or integration of education between 1955 and the 1960s could be a really good topic to revise. It's odd that it's not come up before. I really do think that, or rather odd that it's come up so infrequently. The Montgomery bus boycott. I almost deleted this from this slide because it would have been relevant to Martin Luther King questions last year, and it has appeared in the sample paper and the 2018 paper. But there's a massive gap in between, so perhaps it could come up again. And also the roles of JFK and LBJ. So what was Kennedy's approach to civil rights and what was Lyndon Johnson's approach to civil rights? This last came up in 2019, 6 years ago. So again, if you want to make a comparison between what these two presidents did for civil rights, that might be a good shout. There's quite a few more topics for the Vietnam topic that have rarely appeared. Here are the first two: French rule in Indochina and Dien Bien Phu. Of course, these two are related, especially the French failure at Dien Bien Phu, which ultimately results in Vietnam being split in two, and you can say sets the scene for the rest of the Vietnam War. Because those two things are related and it's only ever appeared in the sample paper, could it be due this year? It would be a fairly obscure thing to ask, but yeah, I could see it happening. Another thing that's a much bigger part of the course is Ziem's rule. I could really see this as being a part of the interpretations question, looking at the different reasons for Ziem's failure, looking at the ways that he might have been a puppet of the USA, looking at the ways in which instead he was actually ignoring what the USA was saying. It would be a pretty tricky topic, but it could happen. If you're unfamiliar with Ziem's rule and his relations with US governments like Eisenhower and Kennedy, it could be a really good idea to look it up. The Gulf of Tonkin incident has appeared a little bit more recently in 2021, but that's still 4 years ago, and it's only appeared once as a pretty important turning point. So if there was a question about the reasons why America got involved in the Vietnam War, this would probably count for that. The Tet Offensive, another really famous part of it. Now this would have been relevant to last year's question on the failure of the US to defeat the Viet Cong, sure, but in terms of having its own discrete question, it hasn't done really since 2018. Another really big part of the course, which has been sort of ignored so far, is Nixon and Vietnamization. This appeared in the 2019 paper, and related to that was the invasions of Cambodia and Laos. Is it time for this stage of the war in the early 70s to get another airing this year? Possibly. If you're unfamiliar, go away and revise it. And finally, the reasons for US failure. That was part of the 2020 paper that hardly anyone sat. So again, is it this turn this year? Decide which of those things you are weak on, and that might guide your revision. Very best of luck. Now we're going to move on to our final topic, Russia and the Soviet Union. Before I get into Russia and the Soviet Union, full disclosure, this is the course that I know least well. I've never taught this one, whereas I've taught the other two, and this is a distant third place in terms of the number of schools that actually do it. Nevertheless, I'm going to attempt to make some predictions. I did so last year, and I got quite a few right, so maybe we'll be lucky again. Last year's exam looked like this. Question number 1 was give 2 things that you can infer from source A about war communism. It was a picture that shows soldiers requisitioning grain. Number 2 was explain why the provisional government was so unsuccessful. Stimulus points being the First World War and the Kornilov Revolt. That was worth 12 marks. Remember that this year you'll get a choice of 2 different 12-mark questions. The inquiry for question 3 looked like this. How useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into the experience of women in the Soviet Union under Stalin's rule? That's important, it's Stalin's rule and not Bolshevik rule. And of course the interpretations questions followed a similar inquiry. So let's get into what things have been repeated. Just like the other topics, because of the narrowness of this paper, there aren't many things that have been repeated. One is the Kornilov Revolt though, as is the provisional government. Quite broad topics of course, but this has been relevant to the 2018, 2023 and 2024 papers, so maybe it's the turn of something else this year. The Russian Civil War could well be what it is. It did appear in the sample paper and the 2020 paper, but remember very few people sat the exam in 2020 and the sample paper was never sat publicly. It last appeared in 2021, so maybe the Russian Civil War is due another look this year. The same might be said of collectivization. This was in the sample paper and the very first paper to be sat in 2018. It last appeared in 2022, which is a bit more recent, but it's still 3 years ago. What about question 3? This is really tricky to predict, but the topics for question 3 that have been seen so far look like this. The sample paper was all about Stalin's Russia and it was focused on collectivization. Then in 2018, it was the revolution and Bolshevik Russia with the Kornilov report. Then in 2019, it was back to Stalin's Russia again. And it repeated that again, Stalin's Russia, but this time looking at life for workers in towns. So it doesn't always alternate, as you can see. It did go back to the revolution and Bolshevik era when it looked at challenges to the Bolsheviks in 2021. And then back to Stalin's Russia again, Stalin and his rivals. And then Stalin's Russia again in 2023. I predicted that it might be a revolution and Bolshevik topic in last year's exam, and of course I got it wrong. It was on Stalin's Russia again, and it was on the issue of women. Luckily though, that is one of the other predictions I made, so people were pretty happy with that. So there have been 3 topics all on Stalin's Russia for the last 3 years. Does this mean we are due a revolution and Bolshevik focus this year? Well, we might do. But I would point out that with the civil rights and Vietnam topic, they had 4 years in a row of civil rights and not Vietnam. So it's not unusual for the exam boards to choose the same part of the course time and time again. So I'm going to say we might be due a revolution and Bolshevik focus in this particular course, but that really is a guess. I might very well be wrong, so make sure that you broaden your revision. That wasn't a very good prediction, was it? But we'll see. As far as I can tell looking at past papers, the following have never appeared, although teachers of this topic might disagree with me. If that's the case, pop it in the comments below. Focusing first of all on the revolution and the Bolsheviks, the establishment of the provisional government has never appeared, although weaknesses did appear in last year's exam, so maybe something else is going to come up this year. Lenin during the Bolshevik Revolution has never appeared, despite it being a pretty important part of the course. And the early Bolshevik decrees has also never appeared, as has Bolshevik decentralization, Lenin and the Politburo. You'll notice that there seems to be a little bit of a focus here of the Lenin side of things, and that might be something to read into. So if you're not very familiar with Lenin's role in the revolution and Lenin's role in the Bolshevik government, that could be well worth looking at. Despite it being the focus of question 3 for the last 3 years running, there are still loads of topics in Stalin's Russia that have never appeared as far as I can tell. Looking at Stalin as leader has never appeared, although it is related to the interpretations in 2022 in fairness. The role of the NKVD, show trials and labour camps in controlling people has never appeared. And its opposite number, propaganda, looking at culture, education, religion and media. The 1936 Constitution has never appeared. Agriculture has never appeared, particularly successes and failures related to collectivization, which was on the sample paper but has never appeared since. After all, the sample paper was never for the public. The failure of the NEP has never been in there, although the introduction of the NEP was in 2023. Industrialisation hasn't appeared, although it would have been related to some of the other questions. And the differing experiences of social groups hasn't appeared, although I would point out that women featured in question 3 in 2024, but other social groups apart from women haven't had their own focus. The following have only rarely appeared, starting with the revolution and the Bolsheviks. The threats to the Tsarist regime, which is pretty broad looking at the impact of World War I, triggers for the revolt, Petrograd, the strikes, etc., that's only appeared in the 2019 paper, so it's possibly well overdue for getting seen again. Then there are other reasons for the Bolshevik victory. That's only appeared in the sample paper. And removing opposition. That's only appeared in the 2021 paper. And the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk has only appeared in the 2020 paper, which, as I've already said, wasn't sat by very many people at all. So could some of these appear in this year's paper? I guess we'll see. Then looking at the Soviet Russia or Stalin's Russia part of the course. The cult of Stalin, features and how it was achieved. That only appeared in 2021, but that's all. Reasons for changes in agriculture appeared in 2022, but again, that's the only time. Living and working conditions in Stalin's Russia, that only appeared in that little SAT 2020 paper. And then industry, looking at Gosplan, the 5-year plans, the Stakhanovite movement. That's only appeared in 2019, so again, it could be well overdue for another revisit. And the reasons and features of persecution of ethnic minorities has only appeared in 2021. Not a very pleasant topic, but then how many of these Soviet topics really are? So could some of these be due a look this year? If you're unfamiliar with any of them, get revising now. Some final advice. These predictions, remember, are more a demonstration of what topics have appeared only infrequently since 2018. As we've seen, exam boards often use the same topics repeatedly, so don't rule them out. The only way of really being sure is to try and know everything. Don't just focus your revision on the predictions. Instead, if a prediction happens to be in an area that you know you're weak on, use that to guide your revision. One way you could do this is to check out the relevant final point slides in my videos and try and memorize the key points. Good way of doing this is by reading each of them for about 2 minutes, then going away, watching another video entirely, and then coming back and trying to jot down the key points that you were trying to memorize before. It's a good way of committing it to your long-term memory. A final bit of advice from me, and something I've always lived by, is this. Once the exam is done, just move on. Discussing it after the event is rarely helpful. You'll only end up mentioning something that you wish you'd put in but didn't, or you'll hear someone else has said something and you maybe think, oh, maybe I've made a mistake. Look, the exam is done. You can't do anything about it. Don't ruin your summer. Instead, celebrate the fact that paper 3 is over, GCSE history is over, and maybe you can start looking forward to A-level revision. On that note, I'm going to say thanks very much for watching. Do please like the video and subscribe to the channel if you want to know more. And like I say, a big way of thanking me for all my efforts is to stay subscribed even after the exam period is over. Do bear in mind that this won't be the end of my videos. I've got some more crime and punishment stuff to release, but also immediately after the exams, or as soon as I can get hold of the paper and the questions, I'll be doing some reflections on them. What predictions did I get right? Was it a fair paper? What might be the implications for you? So do stay tuned for those there. I've got to wait 24 hours before I can publish those, and I won't be able to publish them until I've really got the information from the papers, so do be patient. But they were really popular last year and a great place to discuss how things went. But like I say, you don't want to be discussing that too much, especially with your peers, because it could ruin your summer. All right, on that note, I'll say thanks very much for watching and goodbye.